Welcome back from the break. It is my pleasure to introduce Senator Amy Klobuchar. Senator Klobuchar is the senior senator from Minnesota and the first woman to represent her state in the US Senate. She's a highly effective legislator and is known for her leadership in driving consensus across party lines. Senator Klobuchar is an important voice on digital economy issues. As the chair of the Subcommittee on Competition Policy, Antitrust, and Consumer Rights in the Judiciary Committee, as well as her service on the Commerce and Joint Economic Committees. We welcome Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you, Jonathan, for that warm introduction and for sharing your expertise with today's panel. Hello to everyone attending the third annual Data Privacy Conference USA. I am honored to join so many policymakers, professionals, and thought leaders to talk about what we're doing to protect data privacy in the 21st century. New technologies have made it easier for people to monitor their health, work remotely, communicate with loved ones, and more. But current law doesn't do enough to address the privacy concerns these innovations create. Technology companies such as Google, Facebook, and Amazon collect an enormous amount of information about our daily lives in real time. They know what we buy, who our friends are, where we live, work, and travel, and more. In fact, their very business models were set up around getting that information and then using it to profit. Even though services such as Google's Gmail and Facebook's Instagram are offered to us for free, these companies and advertisers sell the data they collect about us to other companies. So in the end, you can't get around the fact that we are the product, and that's how many tech companies make money. For far too long, big tech companies, many of whom have massive market shares, have been telling American consumers, don't worry, we've got your back, and just trust us. While their identities are being stolen and their data is being mined, our experience has shown that we can't rely on these companies to protect our privacy or compete fairly in the marketplace. And it seems like every day we hear a news story about companies playing fast and loose with data and taking advantage of consumer trust. We've seen data breach after data breach, from Facebook to Equifax, both of which expose the private information of millions of users. But still, tech companies continue to collect and sell personal data, and they're doing so with increasing complexity and precision. This year, there are reports of digital tablets being installed in Ubers and Lyfts that would record passengers' appearances and deliver targeted advertisements to them based on an artificial intelligence assessment of their age, gender, race, location, and assumed interests. And we know Amazon is ramping up efforts to sign customers up to register their palm prints as a payment method, and they recently announced plans to expand the technology of an entertainment venue in Colorado using palm prints as concert tickets. This data has immense competitive value, and the way that it is collected and used impacts customers. I'll give you an example. The simple act of a consumer visiting a utility company's website to pay a monthly gas bill allows dozens of companies to profit off of her, for the most part without her knowledge. Facebook and Google are likely to know about that consumer paying her bill, even though they had nothing to do with the transaction. If the gas company runs advertisements on Facebook, as many do, Facebook would have trackers embedded on the gas company's website. And if the consumer uses the world's most popular web browser, Chrome, Google, she would know what websites she visited. Both companies collect and analyze this kind of information, building a detailed profile of the consumer and giving advertisers access to them online, for a price, of course. Should a person really have to submit to this kind of intrusive data collection just to get a ride home or go to a concert or pay their utility bill? I have reached out to the companies involved to get more information on what they are doing to protect consumer privacy, but more must be done. We need rules of the road, a national privacy law that everyone must follow. So I joined Senator Maria Cantwell of Washington in introducing comprehensive privacy legislation. The Consumer Online Privacy Rights Act, along with Brian Schatz and Ed Markey, establishes digital rules of the road and holds big tech companies accountable. Our bill will help make sure consumers can control how their personal data is being used, including having the right to opt out. It also gives the FTC and state AGs the tools they need to enforce these rules. I have another piece of bipartisan legislation with Senator Murkowski of Alaska to address the limited oversight on new home technologies like home DNA tests and health tracking apps. Our bill will make sure that as new products that collect personal health information enter the market, consumers can be confident that their personal health data is safe. I'm working to work with my colleagues, continuing to work with them on passing comprehensive legislation to protect consumers' data, and it's time to get it done. What else needs to be done to protect consumers both online and off? We have to tackle our country's monopoly problem. To see its effects, look no further than our everyday lives. Why are cable rates so high? Why are there only 2 dominant smartphone operating systems? Why do social media companies face so few consequences for playing fast and loose with our personal data? The answer is simple. They're monopolies. They're the big guys on the block, and there's a lack of competition. We see it in everything from cat food to caskets. I think John Oliver explained it best on his comedy program when he did a half-hour on consolidation, and at the very end he said, "If this makes you want to die, good luck, because the casket industry is now owned by only 3 companies. Actually, it's down to 2. One bought the other." And nowhere do our modern-day competition issues come into sharper focus than with today's big tech companies. We've always been a country that respects success. I do. And yes, these companies are successful. That's great. They've employed a lot of people and given us great services and products. I wear a Fitbit and use an iPhone. But at some point, when companies start to dominate an industry by suppressing their rivals or buying them out, you've got to protect capitalism by making sure there are competitors. That doesn't mean getting rid of these companies or their products. It simply means saying, wait a minute, why did we allow Instagram and WhatsApp to be purchased by Facebook? Maybe if tech companies were more competitive, we would have companies competing to offer consumers new bells and whistles to protect consumer privacy and limit the spread of toxic disinformation. But big tech's grip on markets suppresses the potential of would-be competitors. So how do we take on monopolies today? We must enforce our existing antitrust laws to their fullest extent to protect competition. We must update competition policy for the modern economy, just as we've done centuries past. It's like every 50 years or so we do a major update. It's long past time for today's tech world. My bill, the Competition Antitrust Law Enforcement and Reform Act, would do so by updating the legal standard to prohibit harmful mergers and anti-competitive conduct, shifting the burdens to dominant companies to prove their acquisitions, and most significantly here, their exclusionary conduct. We also have to make sure that our antitrust enforcers have the resources to do their jobs. They can't take on the biggest companies and some of the most complex conduct the world has ever seen with duct tape and Band-Aids. With Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa, I introduced bipartisan legislation to ensure that antitrust enforcers have the resources they need. That bill unanimously passed the Senate Judiciary Committee and was approved by the full Senate. It is now in the House. And we also need targeted reforms, especially when it comes to big tech. Our partners in the House have proposed bipartisan legislation in the tech arena, which I am working on with my colleagues in the Senate. Senator Blumenthal and Blackburn and myself joined me in introducing a bill last month to tackle the competition problems associated with app stores. Vigilant antitrust enforcement will mean more competitive markets, a stronger economy, and a brighter future for everyone. I'm going to keep working with Democrats and Republicans to get this done. By passing laws to protect consumers' data privacy, we can make sure that every American can go on social media, use rideshare apps, pay their bills, and attend concerts without worrying about their personal information being used in unintended or harmful ways. By addressing America's monopoly problem, we can make sure that American consumers have access to a vast array of innovative products and services at fair prices, and that entrepreneurs can start and grow businesses in open, competitive markets. I'm going to keep fighting in Washington to make sure everyone gets a fair shot in the digital age. Enjoy the rest of the panel. You deserve it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Senator. Really appreciate it. Now we're going to turn to our panel on ad tech, which is really where the rubber meets the road with respect to all of the issues that have been brought up all throughout the day. It's important to start with the fact that ad tech is an extremely important part of the digital economy. Yet, it sits amid a constellation of very difficult issues, including privacy and secondary use of data, data security, algorithmic bias and other AI issues, national security, and competition. As the discussion in the United States continues to revolve around a national privacy law as important to ad tech, it doesn't seem to be on the immediate horizon in terms of passing. In light of that, companies themselves, the industry itself, and states have all moved forward in light of the fact that there has been no national privacy law. And it's important to take a look at what's going on in the ad tech ecosystem and where it is going to go in light of the fact that it's not clear that we're going to have a national privacy law in the near term. So there's a lot of activity, though, globally also on ad tech ecosystem, from EU member states enforcing GDPR in the ad tech space to EU, UK, and Australian competition authorities looking at ad tech in terms of digital advertising. And it strikes us as how to frame the problem correctly can help us better understand what are the solutions to those problems that are actually going to work in practice, and what might just be feel-good measures to move us forward. So with that, let me now turn to an incredibly accomplished and fantastic panel to go into some of the depths of the questions that we have for ad tech and to frame the problem so we can begin to turn the corner and figure out how do we really solve the problems. Let me start with Peter Wynn.
So I'm Peter Wynn. I'm responsible for privacy governance at the United States Department of Justice, and we're primarily a law enforcement and national security agency. So when I was asked to participate in this panel, I wondered why. But when I thought about it, I realized the issues we face are very similar. Law enforcement and national security investigators need to lawfully access personal information to do our job to protect public safety and national security. For that, we need the trust of the people, and particularly the American people. If we lose that trust, we risk losing the authority we need to obtain the information that's critical to carry out our mission. Trust is also mission critical for private business, who are going to go out of business if they lose the trust of their customers and other stakeholders. In the United States Department of Justice and other federal agencies, we are all governed by a range of laws, primarily the Privacy Act of 1974. That's a comprehensive privacy framework that applies to federal agencies. And while law is not the only way to maintain trust, the fastest way to lose trust is not to comply with a law if there is one. And that's particularly true if you're an organization called the Department of Justice. So how do we maintain trust? Well, I'd suggest we start by focusing on what everyone agrees are the concrete problems as opposed to abstract generalities. And that requires you to ask people what they actually care about. When you do this, you get very different answers in different contexts and sectors. It's easy to get consensus on general principles such as the Fair Information Practice Principles, or FIPS, the idea of notice, limitations on secondary use, access, correction, security, and enforcement. But it's very hard to draft general rules or laws that are specific enough to actually be workable. So one strategy to do that is to, and different statutes have done this, but you don't necessarily always need a statute. Industries will often come up with codes of conduct of their own, but Article 40 of the GDPR creates a safe harbor for industry codes of conduct. COPPA does the same thing by creating a safe harbor for companies complying with industry guidelines that the FTC has approved. And the Privacy Act that I'm most familiar with uses routine uses that are specific enough to allow agencies to design rules that make sense for them while still having to be compatible with the purposes for which the information was collected. Recently enacted Uniform Personal Data Act from the Uniform Law Commission is also based on this model. and they use what's called voluntary consensus standards. Use of standards doesn't mean industry self-regulation, because all these laws require the standards be recognized by government agencies. But whether or not you use a law or just standards that are within the ecosystem, they have to be derived from a process where the stakeholders in the specific sectors work together to come up with rules they can live with. The only other general point I would make is that privacy is about resources. If a privacy law is too expensive to comply with, you will cause more harm than good, because you will get a lot of non-compliance, which will only destroy trust. If you start with abstractions, everyone might agree they want to control their data, but when it comes to trust, you get the privacy you pay for. Compliance requires resources, financial support, trained personnel, and people to implement a process of continuous improvement. Resources are also needed to enforce a law. So you have to be able to give regulators enough resources to make sure that the scofflaws are held accountable. So those are the very, very general principles I'd suggest. And those principles apply whether you use law or whether you use what I would call industry practices and procedures. You still need to make sure the scofflaws are held accountable. And you also have to make the rules specific enough that you get the buy-in from the people. So, and the cost basis is such that the businesses responsible for following the laws or the rules are able to do so, and you get high levels of compliance. If you lose those levels of compliance, whether it's an informal law or a formal law, you're going to lose trust. And it's important to be able to do what you promise you do, to do what you say you do, because that's the way you lose trust.
Thank you, Peter. Let's turn to Lourdes Turecha. I think you're on mute, Lourdes.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you for that, Peter. Hello, everyone. I'm Lourdes Turecha, the founder of The Rise of Privacy Tech. Our mission is to fuel privacy innovation, and we do this by bringing together the key players in the privacy tech space, which is an emerging space. So these are the founders, the investors, the privacy experts, practitioners, and advisors that advise these startups. Prior to the rise of privacy tech, I was a practicing cybersecurity and privacy lawyer, having advised more than 100 startups and tech companies and global brands on their privacy and data protection obligation. And now focusing on the emerging privacy tech space, which I believe, in addition to laws and standards, that the standards that Peter was mentioning, is part of the answer to our decades worth of privacy technical debt, which includes the ad tech space. So with regards to Jonathan's question on how to frame this, I think we first need to look into identifying the incentives fueling ad tech, and then from that, looking at ad tech's adverse privacy effects and asking ourselves whether those incentives justify their privacy infringements. Many would argue that the business models don't justify surveillance capitalism, and I'm certainly leaning towards that group of folks who believe that. I think in addition to the framing, we also need to look at solutions. So, earlier today, the Senate held a hearing on protecting consumer privacy, and certainly a comprehensive privacy law is part of the answer, in addition to standards like Peter was mentioning earlier. But I would argue that we need to add privacy tech and innovation as another part of the solution. Privacy innovation is disrupting ad tech right now, thanks in part to Google's phasing out of cookies and Apple's iOS 14 and 15 privacy features, but also to the emerging privacy tech startups that are trying to solve some of these privacy problems through technology and not waiting for laws or standards to be passed. So for the first time in history, I'm seeing founders, technologists, investors, regulators, consumers, and enterprise customers agree that we have serious privacy problems, and agree with experts and evangelists and consumer advocates that we need privacy tech and innovation. Back to you, Jonathan.
Thank you so much. Now let's turn to Darren Shill.
Thanks, Jonathan, and good afternoon. I'm Darren Shill with Norton Lifelock. Excited to be on this our panel as a technologist, because my job is really about being a future proofer. And what does that mean? It means that I'm trying to anticipate emerging technology issues, and then, like Lord said, developing innovative solutions that keep us safe. So while we've been dealing with breaches and identity theft that we've heard about in senators' remarks for years, there's also now an increasing privacy attack surface for individuals. And that comes with a digital footprint growth that's hard to see and becoming harder to manage. So for example, what does our lab see right now? Our users are encountering up to 200 tracking companies per week on average. And they come across half of those trackers in just the first few hours of being online. The largest trackers on average know half the browsing history of almost all the users. And so as these techniques that are used to watch us, to track us, and collect our data have become more sophisticated and more pervasive, we also need equally innovative and sophisticated responses to what others know about us. And how do we have that protection against misuse? Because we're seeing at least two other things that are happening here to Americans and those around the world with regards to their personal records. First, exposed personal records and attributes in sensitive categories are causing consumers to pay a hefty price and putting them at increased security risk across the board. In the US alone, there's a new victim of cyber theft about every 2 seconds. And the average cyber criminal is getting them for about $3,000 on average per victim. And that's real harm coming out of our pockets. But ultimately, true cyber safety is more than device security, financial security. It's about protecting our identities and our online privacy. And our research shows there's still a lot of work to be done to enable us to put back that control into the hands of consumers. I believe, as some of my panelists have suggested, that with additional work on transparency, making people aware of what they're being tracked on and how they're being tracked and where that data is flowing, innovative tools, right, that can help protect your privacy, and ultimately just more awareness and education, together we can help people feel empowered, knowledgeable, to confidently live their lives, digital lives, even better. So thank you for having me on the panel, and back to you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Darren. I appreciate that. Let me turn now to Christine Bannon.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm a policy counsel at New America's Open Technology Institute, so the tech policy program at the think tank, and I focus on commercial privacy and platform accountability. Like was mentioned before, this morning, lots of talk in the Senate Commerce Committee about the need for comprehensive privacy legislation, and I think everyone on the panel and at this conference can agree that's long overdue. But what I want to focus on is that our approach to data governance must be comprehensive rather than sectoral. That sectoral approach has been the US's model for many decades, and I think over time it's been shown that those sectors and those lines that we've drawn don't really last or don't really stand the test of time, and a more comprehensive approach is better suited to the systems that we have now. I think one big example of this is fitness wearables and IoT devices. So HIPAA, right, is limited to covered entities that are typically traditional healthcare providers or insurance companies. And we've seen consumer products that are by both big names like Apple and Android, but also smaller companies be integrated with traditional healthcare services, but since they don't have that label as a healthcare provider, they're not a covered entity. They don't have to they don't have the same responsibilities as a different type of company would. Apple's HealthKit and Android Google Fit allow developers to integrate medical records, lab results, and medications to help patients and their doctors analyze this data, but the doctor's office has a responsibility to protect it, and Apple and Android don't. And I think that model has been shown to not make much sense anymore, and just going forward, I think a comprehensive approach is more called for. It's very encouraged last week that the FTC will be enforcing its health breach notification rule, as it indicated, has adopted the policy statement indicating that they intend to enforce it. It's been really under enforced over the past 10 years. And like Peter mentioned earlier, that non-compliance and under enforcement of laws breeds distrust, and the little protections that we do have has really been under enforced. So I think that this new leadership at the FTC, hopefully increased funding can increase enforcement and help rebuild that trust, and not just trust, like there's a reason, right, that consumers don't trust a lot of the companies that they interact with, and that distrust has been well deserved. So that needs to be earned back, and needs to be proven that that consumers can be protected. I think, like in today's hearing, some are arguing that the FTC shouldn't get more funding until Congress passes a comprehensive privacy law, because there's a significant amount of funding that's being considered in this reconciliation bill. And I would just discourage that way of thinking. Even though we don't have a comprehensive privacy law, there's a lot we can do with the laws that we do have. And I'm just optimistic that with this new leadership, hopefully new funding, there can be greater enforcement, greater investigation, and help, just enforce the laws we do have. And we don't need to wait for Congress to act in order to improve privacy.
Thank you, Christine. Appreciate that. Now let's turn to Alex Cohn.
Thanks, Jonathan. So I'm Alex. I lead all of the efforts around privacy and data protection that we're pursuing at IAB Tech Lab, which is a technical standards organization focused on the digital advertising ecosystem. As I think about, and anytime I talk about this subject, which is almost daily, the way that I typically frame kind of the problem space to think about is not like terribly different than I think how Lourdes framed it earlier, with thinking about both incentive structures and emerging technologies. Want to dig ever so slightly deeper into the incentive structures as just opening thoughts here. So, I think if you look at the key actors that are involved in the ad tech space, right, it's more than ad tech companies, right? So ad tech companies are a player in an ecosystem as a technology layer that really starts with brands, right? Brands are wanting to sell things. They demand reach and effectiveness and efficiency in that reach. You've got content producers who are wanting to fund operations, minimize friction to content consumption. You've got aggregating apps that like search, YouTube, Facebook, Hulu, that want to bring sort of content that content producers are creating together in one place, hold on to that audience as long as possible. You've got user agents like operating systems and web browsers that want, among other things, to, at least as it relates to privacy and data protection, want to promise the best security. You've got people who are not monolithic, so there's not one thing to say that they want, but we do know that many don't object to free experiences and tools, but they also, similarly, many are concerned about what they don't know with regard to data collection and use. And then finally, you have the ad tech companies themselves that are seeking to enable that connection between brands that are demanding like reach and efficiency across an audience to content producers that are sort of assembling that audience. So what the real issues here, so besides the fact that there's a lot of actors with a lot of different incentives, the blurred lines between some of those make things really hard as you think about sort of this intersection of privacy, data protection law, and competition sort of concerns, because you've got some companies in this space who act as aggregators, user agents, and ad technology platforms all at once. And effectively, that means that, if you're an aggregator, a user agent like a browser, an operating system, and you provide a bunch of ad technology products, you can turn to brands who want to get reach and effectiveness and efficiency and say, hey, we can offer you that at great scale. And brands like that, right? Like they put a bunch of money into that. So then content producers that aren't those aggregators are sort of drawn to using the big tech platforms like Facebook or Google to monetize, because that's where all the brand dollars are flowing through. So you get this, like, because of the incentive structure, right? And what players sort of sit where in the sequence, you've got this really difficult, gnarly problem. I know everyone wants to talk about their industry as like the most difficult space, but you really, really do have some difficult things to unwind that, if you just focus on, you take the GDPR that's focused on data protection more so than even privacy, data protection can have the effect, data protection, good thing, can have the effect of saying, well, an aggregator, a user agent, and an ad technology platform that is one vertical, like altogether, can hold data within its walls and it's not spraying out everywhere. And that's great from a data protection standpoint. It's not as great from a competition standpoint. So like, there's this balance that I think, and this gets to the second point that Lourdes made, like, that I think the new emerging privacy tech is trying to address. And as Tech Lab, we're thinking about, we work with all of these actors, right? And we're working through what we can do from a standards perspective to balance some of those incentives, but also help companies just respond to the growing fragmentation and patchwork of privacy law. So it's a fun topic to talk about. So I'm glad to be on this panel.
Thank you, Alex. Finally, let's have our next panel member, Katie Mcginnis, talk to us.
Thank you, Jonathan. My name is Katie Mcginnis, and I head up US and Australian public policy for the privacy technology company DuckDuckGo. DuckDuckGo is helping consumers be more private online. We offer a number of services that help people protect their privacy, from our privacy protective DuckDuckGo search engine and mobile browser to the beta version of our newly released email protection service. Our mission is to raise the standard of trust online. While many people desire more privacy, they often feel powerless to do anything about it because the internet has been overrun by companies that have made it their business model to covertly track, manipulate, and exploit people. By contrast, DuckDuckGo is supported through contextual advertisements that are relevant to the search you just ran and not based on personal information we have collected about you. For instance, you can run a search on DuckDuckGo related, looking for a mountain bike. We're going to show you helmets, maybe some advertisements for a bike, but we're not going to show you any information about that trip to Belize or Mexico you're recently considering. We don't collect any user data, and nor do we want to. We're building a privacy layer for the internet, not just because that's what people deserve, but because it will help heal the internet and solve some of the biggest challenges we're facing online right now, like polarization, filter bubbles, and misinformation, making the internet a more trusting and positive force in our society. In short, we're trying to make privacy the rule and not the exception. In that vein, we advocate for greater privacy protections around the world. Here in the US, we support a federal privacy law, state privacy law efforts, and antitrust reform, in addition to staunch antitrust enforcement. Numerous reports from around the world have documented the dominance issues in our digital market, outlining how big tech companies like Google continue to use anti-competitive tactics to maintain their gatekeeper status. And in some cases, they're maintaining a monopoly status over an industry. Yet we lack sufficient competition rules to bar these companies from self-preferencing their own services at the disadvantage of consumers, competitors, and new market entrants. At the same time, as our other panelists have mentioned, we lack a federal privacy law that will prohibit privacy and data abuses. Clearly, we're in an environment where the harm is evident, the need for new rules and laws is evident, but action is lacking. We urge Congress to quickly pass a federal privacy law and antitrust reform bills like the Senator Klobuchar's Competition and Antitrust Law Enforcement Reform Act, as she discussed during her keynote, and the antitrust bills that were recently voted out of the House Judiciary Committee. These bills will help protect people's privacy in addition to making the market more competitive. In the absence of such legislation, we obviously urge the DOJ and the FTC to vigorously enforce the existing rules and laws that we have on the books. It's clear from our continued growth that users will continue to seek out privacy protective services like the ones offered by DuckDuckGo. We're very proud that users trust us to protect their privacy and use us for searches and other activities as they traverse the web. However, you won't hear me talk about transparency or control as a key for consumers to have more privacy online. We need bills with bright line rules and prohibitions, and not just rules that will put more onus on consumers to maintain their privacy. We urge other companies to adopt privacy protective models like ours that make us compliant with any new privacy laws like the California Consumer Privacy Act or the recently passed Colorado Privacy Act. If you don't collect user data, it's much easier to comply with these new privacy laws. We often tell individuals it's never too late to protect your privacy, and that's true for Congress as well as individuals today. We urge users to reach out and use services like DuckDuckGo that they trust to protect their privacy, and urge their lawmakers to pass these rules. Up until then, we're going to continue being an environment where major tech companies control not only our search engines, but also have a duopoly in advertisements, meaning that consumers' user information is collected in vast amounts in order to serve them with advertisements that continue to not only polarize our online society, but continue to make the internet not a force for good. So thank you for inviting me to be on this panel today, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much, Katie, and I appreciate the comments from all of the panelists. So let me kick it off this way, but let me first, as a matter of full disclosure, say that I do use DuckDuckGo as a browser, and I'm a Norton customer. So I just want to make sure that that's clear, and it's a personal choice. I have no other interest in that whatsoever. So with that, I want to start from the point where Peter began with regard to trust. And there was discussions of trust with regard to transparency. But I want to get to I want to conjoin that with the issue of where we are going with technology. Since it's moving very, very rapidly, both in the marketplace and in the labs. My question is, and we'll start with Lourdes and move to Alex and get other people involved, particularly Darren also, which is this. The whole notion of ad tech versus privacy tech seems to my mind, illuminate an issue of we have a very contentious issue that's not trusting. And so the technology is trying to create trust from these two different angles. And it's almost as if, in my background is in national security, it seems like it's almost an arms war and a situation, an arms race between these two technologies. And the question is are we ever going to be able to get to a point in which there becomes sort of stasis between the technologies, where people begin to develop that trust because the technology is coming from many different areas, develop an ecosystem that supports that? Or are we going to get into a situation in which we just get one-upsmanship and an arms race kind of model? Lourdes?
Thank you for that, Jonathan. I guess that's a really good observation. I hadn't thought of it that way. I do see startups that are addressing both privacy tech and ag tech, so they straddle both industries. Certainly, ad tech's been in existence for decades and decades, whereas privacy tech is just emerging. And so I don't know where we're going to end up here. It really depends on whether we listen to consumers and whether the regulators also help and pass laws that will give a chance to privacy tech tools to be able to compete with their more privacy invasive counterparts. As a also a big DuckDuckGo Brave Proton Mail and Signal user here. So I would love to see the more privacy preserving tools gain more acceptance and usage. But I think we all have our roles to play, from practitioners, prospective technologists, even the VCs who are funding both ad tech and privacy tech. I don't know where we're going to end up, but I can't wait to find out.
That last point on the VCs funding, like privacy tech, like having spoken to some of those, I think they're seeing at least the opportunity for a balance. Meaning, and you also see this in the tech that's coming out, is that a lot of the privacy tech actually is still trying to enable advertising outcomes, right? So like, I think it's possible actually that they do come together because of the incentive structure. Interestingly enough, the biggest, most widely known pieces of privacy tech right now are the ones at the biggest scale are actually coming from the biggest sort of players with money in the game in terms of ads and digital advertising. So, you know, with Google, you have Ads Data Hub, which is literally about sort of secure kind of multi-party compute. Facebook is now pushing secure multi-party compute. Google's doing R&D and open sourcing, fully homomorphic encryption. The privacy sandbox technologies, whatever you think about them, like they're falling in this category of privacy enhancing technology, pushed by Google, followed by Microsoft, who has also like clean room technology and Azure, Amazon, massive growth in advertising, building out sort of like blind matching technology, so that secure multi-party compute type technology. So it's really, I think, yes, there are a ton of startups as well in the space, but even a lot of those that I know are, they're working on like login tech or something like that. And maybe then allowing that user to decide whether or not they want to allow a company to create a profile. I know IO is doing that as like a privacy sort of branded company. So I think it gets back to there's blurred lines here too, in sort of who's offering the privacy tech and who are the big ad tech players, which is super fascinating.
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in here because I love what Alex is saying and following what Lourdes has said. And really what it is I've often felt that we've misunderstood the security risks in this ecosystem. And I think, maybe we're calling some attention to that. You called it, Jonathan, an arms race between ad tech and privacy tech. Having been in the security space for over 2 decades, it can be considered an arms race, or it can just be considered, look, you have in some ways with any technology, good use and then misuse. And we often focus on what is an intelligent adversary going to do to misuse the technology. And so when I think about some of this, I look at, is the creation of a third-party cookie good or bad? Maybe, maybe not, depends on the usage. But if it's being a ghost cookie, as I'm seeing more often, and I think in our measurements, we saw that being done on like 30% of the domains. If it's completely invisible to the user, if it can be compromised in the sense of like, your credit card information, your payment information being, intercepted, and then that leading to additional identity theft, that's certainly a concern that we have to think about. And then if you look at like Alex's technologies, we're talking about homomorphic encryption, so maybe we don't have to decrypt it, or we're thinking about maybe federated machine learning, so we don't have to collect all the data. On the other hand, when we've seen those types of advancements, we also have to take the next step. It's incumbent upon us to think about the guide rails that have to come with that. So for example, with AI and ML, we've often thought, hey, let's just train it. We'll feed the data. We'll get rid of the data. Now we don't have that liability. But the problem is with something like a model inference and model extraction technique, you can still query that model, not the data itself, and get all of that out. And so how do we even take something like artificial intelligence and how do we have privacy from that? How can I have the right to be forgotten from, let's say, an AI model?
All right, I want to hold on to that and follow up with that in a minute, but I want to swing it back to Peter to talk about, you mentioned stakeholder relationships in terms of the development of governance models to enable trust. And I want you to expand a little bit based on the conversation that we are having now. But I also want to get your thoughts in terms of who those stakeholders are and how can they best be managed, because there's a sectoral, you mentioned the sectoral aspect, and I want to get to Christine's point about the problems with the sectoral approach. And I can't see anything different. I mean, I can't, it's hard for me to imagine, I should say, the same group of stakeholders coming together for issues of healthcare and issues of advertising for the trip to Belize that I now am considering.
Thanks. That's a terrific question. And the conversation just sort of leads right into it. When information was on paper, you could put it in your pocket and you could lock it up, you could control it. But when information has become electronic and it goes online, it's more like water flowing in a river. And so when you dam a river up to get electricity, you don't want to be finished pouring the concrete before you ask the question how the salmon are going to get upstream, right? There are more stakeholders than just the electric company and their consumers, just like there are more stakeholders than a platform and its customers or consumers. There are advertisers, there are content providers, there are people buying the ads, there are a host of other stakeholders. And what we're talking about are information systems. And I thought your use of the term ecosystem is really very appropriate, because when we analyze an ecosystem, we don't really look at questions of control. We don't look at questions of bivalent relationships. These are multi-complex, extraordinarily difficult, but context-specific problems. And they have groups of stakeholders who can work together to work out the solutions if we create legal structures and social structures to make sure that we focus on that. The fair information practice principles that we're all familiar with actually are based on an environmental model. The person who was the principal author, a guy named David Martin, was the founder, was critically important in the design of the Cape Cod National Seashore, which involves homeowners, businesses, fishermen, local governments, everybody who has an interest in the sustainability of that seashore, the resource, the natural resources, which we're talking about when we're talking about the information here. Everybody has a legitimate interest in that, but nobody has an absolute right of control, and everybody has to work together to come up with a structure that involves using information for the purposes for which it was collected and having a general set of understandings about what those purposes are. We leave that general set of understanding, we typically want to get consent. But within that general understanding, you don't need consent, because it's what reasonable people would expect and have worked out for that particular sector or that particular industry. That's the model that the Privacy Act was based on. It has worked pretty well for the last 45 or so years. And it's the model that you can see successfully used whenever there's a sustainable way of maintaining trust. So trust is not simply about, it's not a zero-sum game when you talk about information. It's a situation where we recognize everyone's mutual interest in the appropriate management and handling of that information. And everyone can benefit if it's used appropriately. But if it's not used appropriate, trust is lost, and then the ecosystem can collapse. And ecosystems do collapse, and we know that. So what's really critical, particularly if we're drafting laws, but even if we're just trying to draft solutions to particular problems, is to maintain structures that involve engagement with all the stakeholders. And that doesn't just mean the consumers and the companies that are collecting their data. It means what's behind the platforms.
Christine, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll say I agree that it's not a zero-sum game, though I think there's often an overemphasis on this idea of user control in these policy conversations that really misplaces the responsibility. think people like talk about users giving their information away or to companies, and it's really not an active interaction like that. It's much more that most of the data that we're talking about is being collected by just passively. If someone using website, they're not choosing anything, they're just choosing to use the product or service because it serves them in some way, right? So I think there just needs to be a shift in that framing. And I really liked actually your example or comparison to the environment. I think that there's, although I'll draw like a different conclusion from that maybe, but but that we, right, like we don't, you know, things that are labeled, that we don't allow products in the system that give notice to consumers that it causes cancer, although maybe smoking is an example of that, but, and because of that, it's okay, like just that notice is enough, or like that, you know, like companies that are putting chemicals in the environment that have these consequences, like they're responsible for those negative externalities, even if it's not like a choice, like you could prove malice that they intentionally chose to do that to their consumers. So anyways, just all that to say, I think that there's this overemphasis on user control can kind of obfuscate what's really happening, and that the real responsibility should be on the companies controlling and processing the information, and that less of the burden should be on the user.
Katie?
Yeah, thanks for joining me next. I really like the connection between the environmental example and the example we have now, because I think, you know, this is a moment where we can't really follow the environmental movement of the 90s and aughts. There's no real opportunity to vote with your wallet on what kind of privacy protective practices you would like to see in the digital ecosystem. As Christine nicely outlined, most of the data collection that users are experiencing online is done passively and without their involvement, and in many cases notice. Despite the many long privacy policies that have been put online, we know consumers don't read them. We know that they're compliance documents mostly for regulators and for folks like us to read. And we know that transparency is not sufficient for kind of allowing consumers to distrust companies and thus go to a competitor. In addition, thanks to the clear dominance we have and monopolies we have in the digital ecosystem, especially within ad tech, it is not possible for consumers, and that means consumers of advertising services, or for users like you and me, to kind of steer away from the companies that we distrust, because there just are not other viable alternatives for these services. So I think that this is a clear environment where, yes, transparency and control can provide some information for users and can provide some additional information for us as people who are talking about privacy and tech issues. But I do think that we have to look at this as an ecosystem, and we can't rely on people to make individual decisions since they're already overloaded with protecting their privacy. And we really need to turn to a comprehensive privacy law to create bright line rules across the industry, not only to protect against these data abuses, but also to incentivize, as we've been discussing throughout this call, incentivize other business models that protect consumer privacy, or at least incite a larger amount of trust in their users.
Thank you. I want to go to a audience question. Lindsay Hendricks asks, personalized ads and real-time bidding are run by algorithms based on the data collected about us. What role does algorithmic responsibility and accountability play in this?
So Jonathan, happy to jump in if I may.
Please.
So as a technologist, we study a lot around algorithmic bias. And some of the things that we think about there is, how do you have transparency both in the algorithm, but also in the data that the algorithm is running on, right? So I like to think about AI and algorithms as being the engines that power things. And of course, data is the fuel that makes those engines work. So equally important is the data have integrity and fidelity? So you need to have some data governance and controls around that, which means you also have to understand how it was collected, how it was processed, and is it being faithfully used. Then Based on that data, you want to look at the algorithms that are being used and fully understand what they are. I think too often it's commonplace to take an algorithm, apply it because it produces results that are verified by a model. But what you really often want to do is add in kind of human in the loop. You want to make sure that what you're using that tool is going to make sense as well. Because we've seen from cases like adversarial misclassification that an adversary can take a perfectly good model and twist it and warp it to produce really bad results. And of course, that ends up in kind of chaos and ruin. So, I'll stop there because I think everybody else probably has comments around what we can do around human in the loop or around algorithmic bias and how we can address it.
I open it up.
I'll jump in. I think that it's necessary to evaluate these risks before the high risk processing takes place and audit after. I think one example of this is the Facebook civil rights audit with the advertising for housing, credit, and employment. After they reached this big settlement with civil rights groups, they made these changes, and still more examples come out about employment ads only being targeted at certain groups, based on sex, race, and other protected classes. So I think both before and after, because it's a continuing process. These aren't static algorithms. So it's just important to keep that up to date.
I'm just going to jump in real quick because I love what Christine was saying about auditing. I think that's a fantastic tool. It's well served in many areas of our lives. We're comfortable with it. We understand it. And all I'm going to add to that is, as a technologist, it's entirely viable to do that in many cases, right? Even if you're thinking of something like AI or ML models as being black boxes that we can't see inside of, that's not entirely true. Our basic understanding of these mathematical models, even if it is a black box model, is we can understand the influence functions and we can test them to see if biases are present. So we can audit in many cases.
Yeah, it's broader than just AI here, but one of the things that we're trying to do at Tech Lab is transparency between businesses. Basically, we talk about there's opaque actors, right, in the supply chain here that's getting an ad to a page, right? When there's an ad request out to this ecosystem that's referenced in the question to getting an ad back. Again, broader than just AI, because I think AI transparency gets really difficult. Not that we shouldn't do it, but as a baseline, though, to start creating sort of hooks for accountability, what we're trying to push is for the industry to basically list who they're working with in what capacities and make that comparable, so you can also see if one company's reporting out on another and the other company's not reporting that, it's kind of this two-sided reporting where somebody's trying to hide something, the other person's going to report on them. So we're not perfect by any means, but we're pushing for, at least at a baseline, getting disclosures out there in a way that not only is to be shown to humans, but so that machines can actually see what's being called by what, which is actually a lot of how the ad blocking technology works. Is it tries to look for known ad tech companies. I think knowing who's planning to work with who. So if New York Times wants to work with 5 or 6 companies to help it monetize, or 10, right? They have that prerogative. But if 75 other companies are showing up, piggybacking along, that's something that should be known, that difference between who New York Times says that they're working with versus, all these other folks that show up. Again, outside of just AI accountability, but starting working on building blocks to get to places where we can actually know who would even be applying AI, right? Because they're receiving data.
If I could jump in there, I'd like to point out that, we've been talking about the ad tech market here, but I think Alex's comments were the first that noted how opaque the market is. We currently have a duopoly in ad tech services. Google and Facebook are two of the biggest advertising suppliers in the US, and as middleman, they get to tell third-party advertisers what return on investment they think that this ad will get, and they also get to obscure from the publishers and other places that are actually placing those advertisements, who is being advertised next to them and how and what rate they were charging. At the top, Jonathan mentioned that across the world, regions are looking at the dominance in the ad tech environment and the privacy and data implications there. The Australian Competition and Consumer Council released this week their report on ad tech services after a long consultation period. And they found that Google, in only Australia, which is obviously a smaller market, Google touches over 90% of all ad impressions sold within the country. And so this is both as a distributor and also sometimes a competitor. They're serving these advertisements. And it's very hard for individual advertisers to know, one, is the return on investment fair? Two, am I being charged a fair rate for this advertisement placement? And three, they're also unaware of what kind of charge that Google is taking along the way and whether or not Google's placing other ads next to theirs that are competing. And so this is a clear environment where businesses, including marketers, need more transparency about whether or not these behavioral ads that we've been saying are worth the investment are actually returning more impressions. And also we need to know, what are actually the rates for ad tech services, since that would help break the duopoly that we currently see in our environment.
Peter, you're on mute.
Could I just jump in and make a suggestion? One of the things that we talked about earlier in terms of standards, the idea of standards being developed through multi-stakeholder groups. In other words, not just the consumers and the platforms, but the advertisers, the content providers, and the other stakeholders. If you bring all those stakeholders together into a community to come up with the rules that would govern any particular platform, what you're changing the nature of the ecosystem in one very, very significant respect. Right now, the platform is the standard. They control it. The real control is over that standard in terms of service, whatever they want to call it. You bring the other stakeholders in, you're going to start to see different stakeholders work together. Civil society groups representing consumers might align with the content or the advertisers because they can see shared interest in the design and functioning of rules that ultimately will determine how the information is appropriately managed. That's where the environmental analogy makes more and more sense, because you don't manage or come up with an ecosystem management plan by just focusing on the consumers and the electric company. You have to think about the fishermen. You have to think about the downriver water users. And all of those people will have interests in the information or in the data that will align with one another in very interesting ways as they come up with the rules that govern how the information should be managed.
Very interesting. So let me ask a question. There had been a number of discussions in the previous panels and the issue of risk assessment, and Darren mentioned this as well, has come up. And traditionally, the way in which people assess risk tends to be almost binary. It tends to get very tactically oriented in terms of vulnerability. If I use a control, does it or does it not reduce my risk? But my question is, do we think that the environment is a better metaphor to use for the ad ecosystem? And if so, should we be adopting risk models used in the environment, and particularly cumulative risk assessments, so that we're not looking at just one piece of data that might get exposed or another piece that might, but rather what is the accumulation of these different risks and what effect does it have on larger issues to include, democracy, national security, personal privacy? So I'll just throw that out for discussion.
Yeah, Jonathan, if I may, I think the analogy is apt in the sense that in many cases, risk is of course a distribution, a probability distribution that we have to evaluate. But more than that, it's really about being able to project ourselves forward in time. what is the risk to my future self? What's the risk to all of us in the future? Identity theft is kind of a canonical case here as well. If something happens to me today and my data is taken, I may have harm today, or I may have harm in the future. Our own studies show that you actually have about a 16% increase in user risk by participating in this ecosystem. I think the same thing happens with the environment. When we're using the analogy, it's kind of clear for us to think about the air we breathe, the water we drink, and of course, the tragedy of the commons there. So I'll pause there, but I think it's an apt analogy to use for this conversation, and I think we should use some of those modeling techniques.
Can I jump in real quickly?
Yeah.
The one tool that we use in the federal government, I use religiously at the department, is called a privacy impact assessment. And we use that not only for the rules, for the systems that we are required to use it for by law, but we also use it for our national security systems that are exempt from the law, because we're actually finding doing that provides very high levels of value to the development of the system. What we also have discovered is that after the SolarWinds hack, I looked at our privacy impact assessment that I did for our email system in 2017. It has my signature on it. I'm embarrassed at having signed that thing because we've learned so much. And so we're updating that to address risks that we're learning about, with knowledge and experience. And so one goal is to start thinking about the rules themselves and the tools themselves as being a continuous improvement cycle. And so long as we're thinking about a fixed set of rules and a gotcha, you violated the rule, you didn't. No, every failure is an opportunity for continuous improvement. And if you focus on the tools that you have appropriately, you can actually suddenly, I'm the one who's called when they're developing new systems, because I'm actually delivering value in the development of these systems, making them simpler, easier, safer.
Great. So Darren brought up the issue of, use the word harms. And so I want to turn to Lourdes now, actually. You wrote a great piece on Medium that went over the different ways that people look at privacy as you were, leaving your stint at Santa Clara, I guess. And there's been a lot of work and some recent important work on privacy harms. And it seems as though what Darren is talking about sometimes is not recognized as a harm because it's not currently tangible. And so there's issues of standing and the whatnot. And I wonder if you would talk a little bit about privacy tech and how it looks at those harms in terms of what it's trying to do. And how should we look at harm? How should we look at harm from this situation?
Thank you for that question, Jonathan. Privacy risk and privacy harms is certainly one of the more challenging issues in privacy today. Even the courts aren't in agreement as to how to address it. And the problem that we are seeing is that there are just so many different types of privacy harms: physical, economic, reputational, emotional harms. And these different types of harms aren't necessarily seen in other areas of the law. Good thing is that brilliant privacy thinkers like Professors Daniel Solov and Danielle Citron has released this really great piece with a suggestion, with a typology of the different privacy harms that should be recognized with a proposal. So I urge everyone to read that. It's titled Privacy Harms. I believe it's on SSRN and was published at GW Law. I think it's a great starting point that goes into not just the different types of privacy harms that we should take into account when we're looking at privacy risks, but also provides a proposal for courts and perhaps the legislature to look into when they're looking at regulating or legislating in this space. When it comes to privacy tech, that's certainly one of the areas that I urge many of the founders and technologists to look into when they're building privacy tech tools. So the first question I ask them is, what privacy problem, what privacy harm are you trying to solve for, right? So we're not, what are you building this tool for? Like, start with a problem, not with a technology. I think I think it forces us to be very honest about certain incentives, and certainly forces the startup founders to be honest about their own incentives and what they're building and who they're building it for and why.
So let me flip that back then to Alex. When you're thinking about technology and you're looking at, what are the next things that you're going to do you marry up the issue of harm and risk to the technologies that you guys are developing?
Yeah, I mean, so like at the end of the day, we do standards. So while that includes occasionally doing open source tooling, so actual software, more often than not, it's about like protocols, guidelines, like interfaces, basically for companies to work together and interoperate in the ecosystem. So that disclaimer aside, yes, the short answer is yes, we do think about risks and harms. The work that we're actually doing in this area right now, I think we're often miscategorized. I think maybe at IB Tech Lab is like trying to create, so take like the disappearance of third-party cookies. We're pegged with like, hey, you guys are trying to create some sort of replacement. Like the majority of the work that we're working on right now in this area is about tools that would allow companies in the stream to disclose who's working together, who's sharing like user identifiers. So like transparency around business relationships that work on identifiers, which is sort of like it's foreseeing risks and harms and making a record of what might have happened, so that if somebody goes back and looks for harms, like we are trying to create sort of an exhaust or traceability. So yeah, we're even though we're not creating like our privacy enhancing technology software directly at Tech Lab, we're definitely focused on like things that we can do from a standards and protocols perspective that would enable someone who wants to go find harms and see areas of risk do so more easily. Yeah. So, and it honestly, and the reason that folks are up for adopting that is like most of the larger companies in this space have reputational risks and need for trust, even if they're not household names, because they're being relied upon by household names. So if you're Walmart, you might be using a company like The Trade Desk. The Trade Desk is not a household name. Walmart certainly is. So Walmart cares from a risk perspective, like that their ad technology provider is actually building to like standards that would enable transparency so that you could look into like harms and risks later. So yeah, realize it's convoluted how to get there from standards. Standards are some, I always like, it's an unsexy area of the world because we're not actually building the software as often as we're helping folks think through the foundations for it. So yeah, hopefully
I think that's very important, and standards are critical to all of this. So thank you for that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually take something you said and I'm going to attach it to an audience question, which gets back to something Christine said. I'm trying to juggle this. So in terms of the transparency, well, the issue that I wanted to ping on from what you said, Alex, really gets to the issue of third-party risk, right? And you were talking about, you're not Walmart, but you have third parties that impact the risk that you have reputationally and other types of risks. So Carla Gonzalez asked, should we expect more clarity on, this is from Christine's comments on health, HIPAA's accountability to non-traditional health providing tech companies, such as cloud companies, who are now being asked to sign business agreements, BAAs. She sees an increase for BAAs where companies are outside the scope of HIPAA. And many of these health, new entrants into the health system, whether it's a wearable device or whether it's an app or whether it's a website that you go to for information, are part of the ad ecosystem. So, Christine, is one way to, in the current situation, to manage some of that risk for people to insist that their medical providers who may be promoting some of these technologies insist on a BAA so that they are at least within the current sectoral approach to protect their privacy?
Yeah, I think that could be a way there, like whether we can expect more, to the question, like whether we can expect more transparency or guidance, it's hard to say. I think the policy statement that the FTC put out put forth an interpretation of breach of security that's been different than how it's been thought of in the past. It's like a traditional data breach, but now it's like any disclosure without user authorization. So that's a really significant shift. And this could be an area where those agreements between the provider and the company like get some clarity and raise the standards. Yeah.
If I could play devil's advocate, I would, just having seen different companies sign these BAAs without doing the underlying work, just for the sake of closing that deal, I don't think BAAs are gonna move the needle that much, to be honest, in my opinion.
Anybody else?
Jonathan, I didn't understand the question. I wasn't sure if they were talking about people who were covered by HIPAA, which would be, insurance companies or payers and healthcare providers, and then their downstream business associates, or whether the question was intended to reference the use of HIPAA as a model to create the same kinds of trust, chains of trust that have been developed in the HIPAA context, in the non-HIPAA covered context of Fitbit and other types of data collection structures that aren't covered by HIPAA at the moment. So I wasn't really sure what the question was focused on, but, in theory, and again, Lourdes, you're totally right that if you just make it a checkbox exercise, people will sign anything to get the business. There has to be accountability, oversight, auditing is key, but any effective standard always requires a certification structure. So you can design non-governmental accountability and oversight structures without necessarily having to rely on law, a formal regulator like the FTC to come after you. But there is an important relationship between regulators like the Department of Justice or the FTC and private companies that come up with those standards, because as we know, if you don't follow a terms of service, the FTC can come after you. And likewise, one of the ways in which you avoid the antitrust problems associated with platforms is you have a multi-stakeholder process for a voluntary consensus standard creating process. I mean, the American National Standards Institute created the voluntary consensus standard structure to address antitrust problems. Because if everybody is, involved in the creation of the standard, what you'll have is the avoiding of many of the anti-competitive aspects associated that we're starting to see now, because the standard is precisely those areas where people don't compete, where people have agreed not to compete, because those are the standards everyone is using.
So Alex, as a standards person, where do you stand on the issue of certification and accountability for those standards?
Yeah, so the certifications we do as Tech Lab are more about, are you built to the specification correctly? I think from an audit perspective, like the stuff that we're trying to do, I was actually just sharing this with our new CEO yesterday, my perspective and strategy on this. We would be best served to create sort of agnostic transparency standards that many organizations that want to do compliance and audit and analysis, so researchers across the globe, analysts across the globe, commercial companies like a PwC, like self-regulatory compliance programs in different places that have, market-based incentives, meaning like a US compliance company trying to do compliance in Europe is not as great as a European entity trying to do compliance in Europe, right? So like our own tech standards process we actually aren't like looking to be the enforcer or even the stamper, other than, again, like, did you build to it correctly? What we're trying to do is create sort of a surface area for analysis for a plurality of actors, so that lots of people, like, it's actually really fun to if you're into Twitter, like, to go on Twitter and see individuals that are using our standards to like look into the ad tech supply chain. Oftentimes they find people are misapplying our standards. And that's brought to light. So like we think a more is more sort of approach. Like, we develop standards that folks can hook into, and then all sorts of players can like do certification programs in part on top of it, and in part also using other tools. So that's our strategy. I saw some head nodding, so I'm glad that like people weren't just like, that's a bad idea.
So we're running low on time. We have only about 9 or so minutes left. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to get some final thoughts from everybody. Whatever you want, and if you want a question to answer, I would love to know people's thoughts on where we think things are going in this space in the next 2 years, given how much change and dynamism there is. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to reverse the order that we went, and I'd like to start with Katie.
Great. Okay. So I'm really paying attention to the cases that are being brought by groups of attorneys general here in the US against Google for their monopoly and duopoly in ad tech, and how they have, further entrenched their dominant position in this market, perhaps at to the harm of other advertisers, new market entrants, and consumers. Governments around the world are considering action against Google for their actions in ad tech. And so it's going to be an exciting next 5 to 10 years. Obviously, these cases will take longer than it would to pass a law. But then again, it's taken us more than 20 years to pass a federal privacy law. So maybe I shouldn't guarantee that. But I think that's really exciting. I'm also really excited for other coalitions to come together to push companies to change their advertising and content moderation practices, like the Stop Advertising on Facebook campaign of last summer. And in addition, I'm hopeful that more companies will embrace contextual advertising as a privacy protective model like we have, since that makes us compliant with all these privacy laws that are being considered, and also means that we are able to attract and keep user trust because we're really keeping them private. Thanks.
Alex?
Yeah, the things that I'm watching, one is we do work with a lot of these different actors, from like media companies that are like serving ads to ad tech companies in between, and agencies and some of the platforms, and advertisers to some degree. So one thing that I'm seeing is everyone is running to their own corner. And that, to me, spells like we're not going to get a great solution in the next 2 years if everyone's running to their corner. And what do I mean by that? Like, I think a lot of the big media companies that have viewed sort of like that, honestly, like have begrudgingly integrated like ad technology, especially real-time ad technology. They're like, this is our opportunity to take back our audience. And I totally get that. At the same time, so they get behind proposals from some of the big platforms that favor first-party data collection, and so I like, that's cool. Like, I think the pendulum should shift back to publishers who are actually like creating publishers across the board, from games to movies, to TV to news, right? Like, they're creating stuff that we engage with, but like, the pendulum shifting really heavily to mass first-party data collection, which includes first parties like YouTube, mail, Gmail, search, etc. Right? Like, are we in a better place? So like, there's a bunch of running to corners, people seeing short-term strategic things for themselves, and maybe getting in bed with folks that they might not otherwise get in bed with. So I'm seeing that, and I'm not super hopeful. Just to be frank, like, I think in the next 2 years, we'll actually, like, I think we're in one of those situations where things are going to get worse before they get better. Like I'm convinced of that like we're not going to see some sort of miracle, because even with the competition sort of, engagement by authorities across the globe, that stuff takes a lot of time. I think it's putting pressure on these companies to come to tables with a bunch of stakeholders. So the optimist in me says, if there are smart folks that take advantage of the fact that there is some pressure on the platforms to come to the table and actually like design with industry, design with civil society organizations, like maybe we can get to something that in 2 years that is a better place than we are. But honestly, my view is things are going to get worse before they get better. They will get better. But over that 2-year horizon, I think you're just going to see a lot of running to corners and a lot of pointing fingers, and maybe even a lot of things going further under the table, because as third-party cookies get removed, device IDs get removed, people connect more surreptitiously. So like on audiences and advertising. So that, that's not a positive note to end on, but it's also a call to action. Like, people stop running to your own corners.
Christine?
Yeah, thanks. Like Katie, I've been thinking a lot about antitrust and privacy and how they're playing off of each other a lot right now. And to Alex's point about first-party data, I think is really important, that's been kind of used as, I don't know, like a cure-all, like this is the single answer. And I don't think that's true. And like someone put in the chat that like Google Flock, like there's parts of it that are good, parts of it that are problematic. And, I agree with that. Like there are parts of it that are privacy protective, and there are parts that seem to be amplifying some like discriminatory groupings that are worse in some ways than other like ad tech models. So just say that the play between antitrust and privacy is becoming a lot more important. And I think that differentiating between what's really anti-competitive and what's pro-privacy, what is, because those are pitted against each other in ways that are sometimes accurate, sometimes not. So that's really what I'm focused on, and want to really promote that we can have both, and just need to be smart about how the two can play off each other and work together.
Thank you. Darren?
Yeah, we talked about trust earlier, and I think I love the quote, "Trust everybody but cut the cards." And privacy tech is a great way of making sure that consumers get to cut the cards and kind of give them some more control over it. I get it. It's not a silver bullet, but it's hard to trust what you can't see, and hard to know the scope of the problem. If we give people x-ray vision about what the problem is, how prevalent it is, where the data ends up, how it benefits cyber criminals when misused, I think that goes a long way towards shining a bright light on some of the darker, corners of the internet, and enables people to feel more confident about how they're living their lives online. I think that can be great. I think that's part of our future.
Lourdes? Oh, you're on mute.
I'm quite optimistic about where things are going. I do agree with Alex that things are probably going to get bad before they get better. And I don't know who's going to win, first party versus zero party versus Flock versus, privacy sandbags. I don't know who's going to ultimately win the ad tech war, if you want to call it that. But I do know that at least now consumers have privacy preserving options with the emergence of privacy tech tools. So that makes me feel good about where we are and where we're going. And then layer on top of that, to add to our tools in our toolbox, we're now seriously talking about a comprehensive federal privacy law in the US, with the Senate having one of those hearings earlier today, and both Senators Cantwell and Wicker calling on the administration to pass it this year. I don't think they're going to do it this year, but at least there is the appetite to address that urgently.
And with 1 minute left, Peter, what can you leave us with this conversation?
I guess I'd leave you with the thought that listening is more important than communicating your thoughts. And what I'm hearing from this group is that there's general consensus that you have to ask people what they care about in order to find out how to go about maintaining their trust, that is a responsibility for everyone in the ecosystem, and that beyond that, there are obviously different interests and people can get crosswise with one another, but we have to make sure that all the stakeholders are in the room. And when that takes place, we're actually going to be much closer to where we need to be than we are now.
Well, with that, I want to thank the panel very, very much. Appreciate it, and wish we were all in the same room so you could hear the applause of the audience. So with that, I thank you very much, and that concludes this panel.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Thanks, everybody.